Thank you. All right, so not an entire review, but just a quick review. Not going all the way back since the last time that I taught, but in chapter 21 of Samuel, we had Pastor Cal teaching, and we saw in chapter 21 a change in David's life where he became a fugitive, and he had been hunted by Saul, and we're going to see that continuation all the way through as David is hunted by Saul. Overall, that period of the wilderness, of him being hunted, was about 10 to 12 years. And out of that time frame and out of that burden is where we get many of the Psalms. Couldn't help but note down, Pastor Cal pointed out, he said, how many of us find comfort in the Psalms and that find them to be a blessing for us? And I was thinking when he said that, it wasn't comfortable for David. So again, thinking about God's sovereignty, we have one person that is going through all these trials, and out of all these trials, he is able to come up with these psalms, these praises for God, and it was not a pleasant experience. But then on the other hand, we have so many people who receive a pleasant experience from someone's unpleasant experience because of God, and that's just God's sovereignty. So David, he's on the run. He meets the priest Ahimelech in Nob. The priest is fearful of David when he first showed up. Why is he here? And he questions that, and David lies and says that he's on a mission for the king. And in that whole chapter, pretty much, we saw lies and deception. To some degree, David had lost his trust in God. He was no longer secure in that, or at least he felt no longer secure in that. And he felt he needed to lie for his survival. And he was doing the lies that he was coming up with, in his opinion, were helping to make him safe. And in doing that, he was not relying on God. He was confronted with various circumstances, and Pastor Cal pointed out that in those circumstances, we didn't hear or read anything of his prayer or his supplication. Only actions of self-dependency. Stuck out to me in verse 8, and we're going to kind of put verse 8 from 21 here on a shelf, and I'm going to come back to it in 23. But in chapter 21, verse 8, David is asking for a weapon, and Pastor Cal brought up again, we didn't see a prayer with the priest, but we saw him asking the priest to give him a weapon. He didn't see him use a sling, but he wanted the sword of Goliath. So at one point he used nothing but a sling, and here he is now wanting the sword of Goliath. And he continues his escape into Gath, and then Pastor Cal reminds us that fear is always the enemy of faith. So another asterisk I put down when I was taking my notes. Fear is always an enemy of faith. And for David, the fear of God had been replaced by the fear of man. And we saw 3 specific lies in that chapter, and each one of those lies worked. But the end result was not positive, right? The end result to those lies that worked actually were tragic consequences. And then in 22 with Tom, he pointed out we should always be looking for 2 things when we're reading the scripture. And in our study, what is God doing and how are the people responding? And so David in 22 leaves Gath. He moves about 10 miles. He comes to a cave. We're not told why, but he ends up getting his family to go along with him. Had approximately 400 men, but he had some concern for his immediate family. And the word said that those 400 people that he had gathered with him, that some of them had some issues, right? Some of them had some problems. No, all of them had something. It says everyone was in distress, debt, or bitter to some degree, right? And then Tom pointed out from that God gathers the most unlikely people to accomplish his mission. And David would have had the men with him that Jesus referred to, those who need a physician. Right? That's the people that David had around him. That's the people that Christ came for, those in need of a physician. And God at that point is building David's army from broken people. just like he builds his church. So David takes his people back to his family, rather back to his people of his great-grandparents, the Moabites. And chapter 22 was more than David just being in a cave. It was more about what God was doing in David's life. And when we're reading it, we're reading what's happening to David, and maybe we lose focus on what is God doing overall in this. And we're starting to see a transition from 21, 22, and then into 23, a transition in David's life where as we get into 23, he's more mature and he's more reliant upon God. So what God was doing was putting David in a position or situation where David would have to rely on him, right? Because if he didn't, if it was always, everything was peachy with him, then he would probably do like most humans do, rely on himself because everything is going well. But at this point, we're going to see that transition where he begins to rely on God. And the prophet Gad told David to head for Judah, which kind of didn't make sense if you were in David's camp, but David was obedient even in the face of danger, because heading to Judah would have put him in a closer proximity to Saul. But if David had been allowed to stay there, he might have become comfortable, and he wouldn't have felt the need to rely on God. And Tom pointed out that God still does that today for us, right? Those times when we're in comfort, maybe we don't rely on God as much, and as soon as that wrench gets thrown into our path or into our plans, maybe that's the time, we start to act in a way we should have been acting the whole time. So Saul no longer has access to God. He was furious that this priest had inquired of God on David's behalf, even though, if you remembered, he didn't really do that, but that's what Saul had been told, that this priest had interceded on God's behalf for David. And so Saul's leadership, because it was fear-based, he ends up having all those priests, 85 priests, killed. The people that he asked to do it, the soldiers were like, "Oh, we're not doing that." And then he had another person that's like, "I'll do that," and he killed all those priests. That happened because Saul thought something had happened. He didn't have proof. He just had a man's word. And he was upset because that priest had actually poured salt into his wounds, because the priest didn't know. He thought there was still that connection between David and Saul, and he was singing David's praises. And that just infuriated Saul even more. So this result in Saul, Tom brought out, Saul actually became the new Goliath. Right? He's massacring a town of priests. He's now the enemy of God's people. He has that fear-based leadership style, and he had surrounded everyone around him were his own people of the Benjamites. Basically, he surrounded himself with a bunch of yes men, and it was all out of paranoia. And this result was a progressive jealousy that always ended in murder. And we see that even when it didn't end in murder, we saw murder in his heart, where Saul would have that jealous fit of rage and he would throw those spears, even to include in past chapters to his own son. He had no one to hold him accountable. Tom pointed out he didn't have a Nathan, as David did. They say, "Hey, where's your heart on this? What's going on?" He didn't have that. He had no one to hold him accountable. Everybody that was around him told him, "Great job, King. That's what I would do." So Tom also pointed out, again, interesting, Tom pointed out the massacre was a fulfillment of God's promise to wipe out the family of Eli. So again, everything connected and loops back. God had made a promise to Eli that he was going to wipe his family out based on his actions, and that's actually that coming to fruition. David makes a commitment at that point to the priest Abiathar for his safekeeping, and in so doing, that was a picture of Christ being a refuge of the persecuted. As we move into 23 from 22, we're going to continue to see that maturity of David. It's no longer now in 23, it's no longer just about David's survival, It's going to be more about David's relationship with the Lord. Now, David is going to save a town. He's going to do so at more risk to himself, so that survival instinct is there, but it's overshadowed by his duty to Christ. And that is going to be a foreshadow of God, through Christ, saving us while we're still his enemy. And so, before I get into reading the first 14 verses of 23, I just want to point something out. Marvin was getting on me earlier because I was writing some stuff down. He said, "You should have done it already. That should be done." And I'm like, "You're right, man, but this is hot off the press," right? Because we were in prayer this morning, and I couldn't help but listen to my brother's prayers, all of them amazing, encouraging prayers. But 4 things popped into my mind during the prayer, and I'm trying to be in worship and pray, but I'm trying to remember this because it was a moment. I was just like, man, this is just amazing. 4 different people brought up 4 specific things, and they all come to play in chapter 23. And one brother said, our circumstances don't dictate our worship. Man. And we're going to see how that was David to some degree, but now not so much. One prayer, part of one person's prayer talked about pride and how we would not be consumed with our pride. That's in 23. One person in their prayer brought up service and how we would serve our King, and that's in here today. And then one person brought up encouragement of the brothers, and we're really going to see that in here today. And I just couldn't help but think as we were praying this morning about how it's all intertwined, but even on the hearts of individual believers, we have what's in the Word today. How wonderful that is. So if you're in 23, go ahead and I'll start reading 1 through 14. Now they told David, "Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, Shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. When Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David to Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. Now it was told to Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself up by the entering a town that has gates and bars. And Saul summoned all the people to war, to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, Bring the ephod here. Then David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down, as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said, He will come down. Then David said, Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, They will surrender you. Then David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. And David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hands. So David's told the Philistines are raiding a town called Keilah, and the town of Keilah is in the middle of Judah. Right off the bat, David's response could have been, and I put this in my notes, NMP. Anybody know what that stands for, NMP? Not my problem. That probably would have been my response. I'm being hunted by the king. I hear this thing going on. It's like, why is this my problem? I'm not the king. It's not my responsibility. But we don't see that from David. David hadn't been ordained as the king, and at that point, he's actually outside of the law, when it comes to the king Saul, he dictates what the law is, and he's after David. He's being pursued by the king. And he could have easily have just said, sorry to be them, right? And actually, if you think about it, his best strategic move would have been, this is great. Because if Kyla's being attacked and Saul's going to go protect Kyla, that's going to give me a chance to scoot out of town and get some distance between me and Saul. And as I'm reading and studying this, I'm thinking, I probably would have let that immediate circumstance do the same thing for me. And strategically, I would have said, hey guys, here's what we're going to do. This is what's happening. This is where we're going, because all the attention is over here. And in so doing, I probably would have prayed as I did my own will. But that's not what David did. His best strategic move would have been to go the opposite direction, but not David. He rushes in, sweeps in, and slays the Philistines. That's not what he did either. Not exactly, right? But verse 2 tells us David goes to the Lord, which is really different than what he had been doing in the past, as far as his first reaction. He's not as rash as we had seen him in the past. He doesn't presume that that's his obligation and that's what he needs to do. Rather, he goes to God and asks him. He's still a warrior. He still has that. If you think back to the other chapters where when he rushes in because of Goliath had just offended God, and how he and Jonathan had that bond where Jonathan was mad of the uncircumcised and how they had defrauded God. He still has that righteous anger about him, but that wasn't his first reaction. He is not, at this point, David is not a servant to his feelings. He knows that he's a servant of the Lord. And what does a servant do before a servant does anything? Checks with the master, checks with the boss, and that's what David is doing here. And this is a difference here. There's a difference between our feelings and what we're told by God. And too many times what we do is we go with our gut feelings, right? And when we do that, that automatically presumes that we know more than God. And at this point in our lives, we hear from God from His Word, right? And so that's where we should always be going for our direction. And so David is doing that in inquiring from the Lord what he should do. And he gets the answer, go save Kyla. And we read in verse 3, his men were a little bit hesitant about that. They admitted to him, hey man, we're a little afraid and upset, right? We're afraid just being in Judah, this close to Saul. This is not comfortable. And now you want us to leave here and go somewhere that's even more dangerous. And if you remember, who made up that group of men? They weren't the CEOs, right? They weren't the generals. They weren't the priests. Again, these were the downtrodden. These were the broken, right? And that type of person would have been somebody that would have automatically been a little reserved when it came to doing stuff like that. And they're saying, hey man, there's a reason we're hiding here. Like, let's just stick to the plan. Is this really the best course of action? And to the human mind, I would say no, that was not the best course of action. Let's just rush in and face these Philistines while we're being pursued by the king and his men. We're going to leave all of our security. We're going to face a dangerous foe. And when they do that, they're automatically going to let Saul know where they're at. See? From the perspective of man, this is a no-win situation. But in verse 4, David shows his heart, right? He shows his heart both to God, but also his heart to the people, because he goes to God a second time. And David didn't just say, I told you we're going to attack. Now get your stuff and let's go. He didn't say that. He didn't do that. He went back to God. And that allows us to see David's heart and we know that David had the heart of God, and we see these two hearts are the same, right? David senses that his people are uneasy. He takes the best course of action. He goes to God again. He's not overbearing. And he goes to God again because he was a man after God's own heart, and the Lord answered him. And we notice when he answered him, he didn't get struck by lightning for going to him a second time. He wasn't chastised. Matter of fact, look carefully at what he was told that second time versus what he was told the first time. He gets a little bit of extra details. So this time he's told, arise. So that's telling him to take action. Like, come on, get up, get going, let's do it. Go down to Keilah. Basically, do what I told you to do. For I will give the Philistines into your hand. So he's getting a little extra here. He's getting a little cheat code. He knows at this point that the mission is going to be successful. So God is building him up in this. And in turn, he will be able to build up his men. But the Lord has patience with David, just as David is having patience with his men. And in verse 5, they're obedient. They go into battle. They struck a great blow. Matter of fact, they come back with all the loot and the spoils, and they would have need that. So they not only do they save the town, they win the battle. They come back with the spoils. And remember, these are people on the run, so they would have needed supplies. So they have that. And what we had was David, while not yet king, sees a people of God in need, and his first thought was to take care of the people of God. First thought after, well, that was his first thought, and he went to God to verify it. He checked with God first, but overall he obeys God, even with a potential to his own downfall. Now, God told him, you say, well, God told him they're going to win the battle, but God didn't tell him that he would survive, right? He knew the overall outcome, but he didn't know the details. He didn't say he wouldn't get hurt. He didn't say he wouldn't get maimed. He didn't say how many people he would lose. He just knows the overall outcome is they're going to win. But at that point, David is not concerned with himself. So what's the application in that for us? We have to trust God even when the moment doesn't make sense. Can't rely on our wisdom because we don't have the wisdom of God. And there are manifold purposes behind the commands of God, of which many we don't even know. There was then, and there is today. And we need that trust today. It should carry over into our service to God's church. We're to serve God's church, serve God's people, even when it doesn't feel right. Even when our gut feeling is, I don't know. Or, I don't see what do I get out of this? This doesn't profit me. We should be more like David. Even when at first glance it's not convenient or profitable. So specifically to the orders that's given to David, it wasn't about David being a protector. It wasn't just about David being the protector of Keilah. God had another purpose that David didn't know about. Because when God is sending David to protect Keilah, he's actually saving him from Saul. He's protecting David and Keilah at the same time. It's easy for us to read it and see God's providence, but understand it wouldn't have been as easy for David in the moment to see that. He would have faith in God doing that, but he couldn't see it, tangible evidence in his face. God calls David, and in so doing, he protects both of them. And when we're reading this, I appreciate it in this part of it, talking about God's providence and how he's doing more than one thing, and we can't see all of that. One commentator, and I'll quote him, says, if Jesus is your genie, this part, talking about this part of the scripture, if Jesus is your genie, this will put you to sleep. But if Christ is your Lord, then be comforted by what is being said here. God is teaching us that in his direction, even in the unknown, one thing you can plant your feet upon and be totally secure in is that God always positions us to prepare us for his use. Not about us. We're just the instrument. We're being prepared for God's use. And in every season, this is not a quote, this is moving on. In every season, God has determined a purpose for our lives. And that purpose, oftentimes we get confused or can get confused with what our purpose is, to do A, B, or C, X, Y, and Z. But our overall purpose is to bring him glory. And that doesn't mean that that's going to come to us in situations where there's butterflies and rainbows and all kinds of happy, feel-good situations. Now, often those moments he puts us in can be confusing and painful. But we have to walk in obedience. We have to arise and go to Kyla, even when it doesn't make sense. So verse 7 and 8, Saul got the men. He got them to go to war. Finally, Saul gets them there. But notice, why does he get them there? He's not getting them there to protect Kyla. That part's already been taken care of. He's getting the men to go down to get David. And if he has to destroy Kyla or harm the people in Kyla to do it, he's willing to do it. But Saul finally gets his men to go to war in Kyla. He's willing, the protector of Israel, is willing to harm not only David, who is part of his family, but he's also willing to harm the people of Kyla, all because of his pride. The battle's already over. Kyla's safe. Saul goes down when it's safe, but it's just to get David and his men, right? And even worse, we read in 7 and 8, Saul, if you look there, he sees it as a blessing. Finally, God has blessed me. He's got Saul he's got David just where I need him. The king of Israel is going after the deliverer of Israel and doesn't have a clue. Think back earlier in our study of Saul when he's getting ready to be anointed. If you can think back, and what was Saul's purpose to be as king? Specifically, it's in chapter 9, 15, and 16. If you remember, they've lost the donkeys. And so, remember, Saul doesn't even know where Samuel is, but his servant did. He's like, hey, man, let's go see the seer. He's going to help us find these animals. And they go there, but while that's happening, at the same time, in verse 15 through 16, it says, as God is preparing Samuel, now the day before Saul came, so Saul's coming to find the animals, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel, about this time tomorrow I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people, and he will, what? What's that? Yeah. A little bit deeper. Just take that shovel and push it in just a little bit deeper. From the Philistines. That's his purpose. His whole purpose is to deliver Israel from the Philistines. And he's out of it. This is an Old Testament example of you have one job. Right? Yeah, he's to protect his people, exactly, from the Philistines. And he's totally missed out on that because of his pride.
But David did that.
Exactly. While he was not, that wasn't his intended role. That was Saul's intended role, right? Saul's purpose as king is to protect Israel from a specific enemy. Here we're at a point where that specific enemy is doing harm to God's people. And what is Saul doing? He is in a fit of pride. Not only did he not do it, he's so focused on killing David, he thinks it's a blessing from God. That's how deceived he is. Saul's been told he's already been told he's lost the kingdom. We've been told he hasn't had the Spirit of God for some time. He's never, the whole time we've read this, he's never shown any desire for the glory of God or to bring glory to God. He's just killed 85 priests. He had a tormenting spirit, and as Pastor Cal pointed out, we never read that spirit left him. And through all of this, he still thinks God's on his side. And what we have here is an example of what we read in Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? Now, how many times, I was talking to Brian earlier before Sunday school, how easy it is to get down rabbit holes when I'm studying for this. I have to fight that urge. But how many times, so I was trying to find out how many times in the New Testament are we commanded not to be deceived? And I told him, I'm going to find out. But then I found myself on this rabbit trail. I'm just hour after hour. I'm like, that's not, stick to the course. Right? But just a quick Google search told me 52 times. Don't know if that's accurate or not. But we are told repeatedly in God's word, do not be deceived. And often when we hear that, at least when Alan hears that, I think of the deception as external. Wolves in sheep's clothing, right? You got to be careful. I'm not sure about such and such. It might be a wolf. But there's another kind of deception that's even more lethal. And that's internal, right? 1 Corinthians 3:18, Paul says, let no one deceive himself. How dangerous is that? And we see how dangerous that is right here with Saul and what he's doing. Saul has the title, David has the fruit. The application, we have to ask ourselves, do I have both the title and fruit of a Christian? Or do I just have the title? Saul is all about Saul. Are we about ourselves, or are we about God? Or are we about God's kingdom? So Keilah is surrounded by the Philistines. Saul, again, he's hanging out in the back. We call that in the rear with the gear. And I couldn't help when I read that. If you remember back, that's where Saul was found at one point with the gear. And that's been his MO the whole time. He's never where the action is when there's action to be taken. And I think I have to ask myself the same thing. Where am I? When action needs to be taken for the kingdom, where am I? Am I in a pew? Or I'm actually in action? Saul, he's in the back. He's focused on satisfying his envy, his jealousy, his hatred. He's not fulfilling his calling. And if we're not careful, we can fall into that same deceptive trap of not fulfilling our calling. We have to stay kingdom-minded and kingdom-focused because our mission is to bring our Master glory and to grow his kingdom. Serve his people versus our own selfish ambition, desire, or interest. The Philistines were a threat to Saul's people, and that's what he was commissioned to do, protect his people from the Philistines. But David was a threat to Saul's pride, and that's where he focused. And again, the sad thing, I mean, it's all tragic and sad, but for me in reading this, the saddest thing is he took it as a blessing. He's so deceived that he thinks this is a good thing. Looking again at verse 9. David knew that Saul was plotting to harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Then David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. So David finds out that Saul is about to pounce on him. And we see again another example of David's maturity, because he tells the priest Abiathar to bring the ephod. Now, if you think back to verse 6, we're told that Abiathar had escaped. So all these priests are being killed. One escaped, makes it to David. David said, hey, stay with me. The same person that's trying to kill you is trying to kill me. I will protect you. So that's the priest we're talking of. And at this point where David realizes, man, Saul's about to take us, he calls for the priest, and specifically, he calls for the ephod.
So is it the priest? I thought when he said bring the, in verse 6, he had an ephod in his hand. He didn't have the priest in his hand. He had the vest under the garment, right?
Right, he came and had the ephod in his hand, right, and brings it with him. And now, at a separate point in time, they're about ready to be attacked again, and David calls for the ephod. And the ephod is a vestment of the high priest. David now, in a moment of danger, he wants to go to God. In part of that garment, that ephod, was the Urim and Thummim. I'm going to pronounce that wrong. But that was two rocks, so to speak, and they were used to discern God's will. It was basically going to give them a yes or no direction. And so when David's calling for this ephod, this is specifically what he's calling for. He's going to call upon God. And this is a big contrast. Remember, I told you we're going to put something on the shelf here from 21. So here we are right now. Saul's getting ready to come, and David tells, hey, bring me the ephod. But think back to 21, when David was on the run. He was with another priest, and he didn't have a weapon, right? You remember that? David goes to the priest in the prior chapter, and in verse 9 of 21, and the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth, behind the ephod. If you will take it, take it. And David says, that's a good sword, give it to me. So this isn't in Scripture, but if you're like me, when you're hearing things or reading things, you're making a picture in your mind. So think about, like, the priest had to go around the ephod in an earlier chapter to get to the sword. David wanted the sword. In between the sword was the ephod in 21. And David could have said, hold up, there's an ephod there. Bring me that. Let's go to God. Maybe I won't need to use the sword. But earlier on, when he's less mature, he doesn't do that. But here he does. Here he says now in 23, he says, bring me the ephod. So we see here David is being obedient over feelings. Before he was relying on his feelings, self-survival. Now he's saying, what does God say I should do? Bring me his word is basically what he was asking. David's trials at this point have molded him to inquire of God for direction versus doing what feels right. And then in 10 through 12, David prays, and we see his prayers answered. He's told Saul will come, and the people of Keilah will turn on him. The people you just saved, when it wasn't your job to do so, are now going to turn on you. David did what Saul should have done the whole time, and those people turn on him. Or those people, God is telling him those people are going to turn on him. And before we can get mad about the people of Keilah, we have to understand they're a reflection of us. David at this point is pointing us, David at this time is pointing us towards Christ. The rescue of Keilah at the hand of David gives us that picture of Christ. Christ doesn't redeem his friends. He doesn't redeem the worthy. All who are saved by Christ are hostile to him prior to their redemption. It's only by his application of grace that the redeemed are moved from hostility towards him. So we see that here. We see that pointing towards Christ. David's men have grown now to about 600. They leave Keilah, and Saul finds out about it. He stops chasing them for that moment. David remains in the wilderness. Specifically, he goes to the land of Ziph. And then we ended right there at 14, which tells us two significant points. It says, Saul sought him every day. How consuming is that? And that's what stuck out to me in the prayer this morning about the request is that we not be consumed by our pride. How consuming is it that he was sought every day? Have you ever been in a position where you have been consumed every day by something? I can say I've been in those positions at times, but I've never every day for my life have been consumed by some type of jealousy or pride or anger. But we see that here in Saul, that every day he was consumed with David, when his calling was to be consumed for his God's glory every day. And then we see the other significant thing, but we have another but God here, right? But God did not give him up. So we move into 15. David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph, and Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this." And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained in Horesh, and Jonathan went home. Then the Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeath, and saying, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds of Horesh, on the hill of Heklah, which is south of Jeshimon?" Man, I should have got y'all to read this. South of Jeshimon. "Now come down, O king, according to all your heart's desire to come down, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand." And Saul said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Go make yet more sure. Know and see the place where his foot is, and who has seen him there. For it is told me that he is very cunning. See therefore and take note of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with sure information. Then I will go with you. And if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah." And they arose and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Mon, in the Abra to the south of Jeshimon. And Saul and his men went to seek him. And David was told, so he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Mon. And when Saul heard that, he pursued David in the wilderness of Mon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul, saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land." So Saul returned from pursuing after David, and went against the Philistines. Therefore that place was called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of Engedi. So we read just at the end of 14, Saul had given up, but now he's back. And again, we read that he sought him every day, and how consuming that would be, right? That type of jealousy will wear you out. It will eat you up, and that's what's going on with Saul. But now we read something different. We see Jonathan, the faithful friend, comes to a rescue. David surrounded by his enemy. The Philistines are after him. Now Saul's after him. The people of Keilah betrayed him. Saul's constantly trying to take his life. There had to be pressures with all of that, right? So I'm sure if you look at the pictures of a president before they take office and after they leave office, how gray they become, right? I'm sure that had to happen to David with all the stress that was going on in his life, right? But we see here a faithful friend comes to the rescue. Saul's his primary enemy, right? But think about that. Saul is his primary enemy, and who's his primary friend? His son. The father and son, right? There's a covenant relationship there. So the word told us in previous chapters, Jonathan and David's hearts were knit together. Notice in verse 16 it says, Jonathan rose and went to David in Horesh. Saul can't find David. Saul's looking. He's going everywhere he can't. And we read, Jonathan, I'm going to go see David. How'd that come about? Right? And as conniving as Saul was, I say I struggle with that. I don't understand it's God's providence. But the human side of me is like, as conniving as he was, how could he not find him? It'd have been easy, right? I'm pretty sure if I could get David Fuller and Larry Covington and get them together and we could teleport back in time. I've heard the stories of how good those guys, like we'd have found David. And he had all those spies and he couldn't find him. And yet Jonathan just gets up and goes and meets with him because of the sovereignty of God on both ends of the spectrum. Here to protect and here to confuse. Had to be the sovereignty of God. All he had to do was watch his son. He knew his son had a covenant with his enemy. He just had to watch his son, but he couldn't. So Jonathan finds David, and he brings him food, ammunition, weapons, vehicles. None of that. It says, no, he strengthened his hand in God. He encouraged him. He brought him words of encouragement. He spoke truth to him. Don't fear. Saul's not going to touch you. You will be king, and I will be at your side. Even my father knows this. These are the words that he encouraged him with. And in the end, they renewed that covenant. And then they parted ways. So again, I'm studying this, and I'm seeing, man, all the things the king's son could have brought somebody in need that's on the run and would have needed. But he brought him encouragement, and then I hear a brother praying for encouragement of the saints, and just amazed at God's work. Right.
When I was reading that was like, because we're not really told, with Jonathan, we knew back at the very beginning that, when he went that time with one other, the guy that was with him, and they ended up, in the battle. And during this time, we don't know where he stands with the Lord, but here, obviously, we know he has to have some type of standing for him to, come to David and to lift him up for him. But I felt like that was kind of like a parallel.
Yeah, exactly. All the things he could have brought him, he brought him the encouragement. And we can do that today with our church family. There's, as bad as we may have it, there is always going to be somebody that's going to have it worse than us. And sometimes just simple encouragement is what it takes. And that's what we see Jonathan doing here. The last part for me was eye-opening because the son says the father knows you are going to be king. Again, despite all of Saul's sinful actions, right? Despite being turned over to his own deceit, he knows God is on David's side. He knows what the will of God is, and he is not doing it. Application, we have to ask ourselves, where are we? Do we delight in the will of God, or are we resistant to it? And we have to ask ourselves daily, what am I doing for Christ? This is the picture that we're given here is David is a reflection of Christ, right? We're either going to be in a covenant relationship like Jonathan and David. We're either going to be in that covenant relationship with Christ, or we're going to be in that relationship like Saul and David, where we will be an enemy of Christ. In Christ, like David, he's the king. And when he returns, right, it may seem, if we are against Christ in this life, it may seem that we have escaped, but we won't escape in death. And David, David he's here in the land of Ziph. And we see the Ziphites in chapter 19, they rat him out too. They go to Saul. And the Ziphites, again, are people of Judah, his own people. Turn him over to Saul. And then Saul says to them in 21, may you be blessed by the Lord. One commentator likened this to the language of a goat living amongst the sheep. Again, we see his distraction. And then, so I had to check on this before I threw it out there, check with the pastors and the elders this morning, because how slimy is Saul, right? How often, I use the word, I had to make sure this came from Elder Chuck Lane, right? But he used to use this word. But I say, how often do we talk churchy, but we think worldly? And that's what Saul's doing here. Saul's talking churchy to these people. May you be blessed in the Lord. And all the while, he's plotting murder. He's talking churchy, but he's thinking worldly. And notice Saul doesn't go after David when he hears of his location. There's still no bravery on his behalf, right? He wants him dead. He's still going to hedge his bet. He's going to get other people to do the scheming for him, right? Ultimately, he wants to find David's weakness, and that's just like the devil, ultimately waiting to find our weakness and pounce on us. It's a cat and mouse game, right? At this point, at the end of the chapter, there's this mountain, and they're kind of maneuvering around the mountain. And some commentators say that Saul probably split his forces. So now imagine you're chasing somebody around this mountain, but now the enemy splits the forces, and here you're in a tight spot. In verse 28, the Philistines are attacking, and Saul gives up the moment, right? Because a messenger providentially comes to him and says what? Philistines are attacking. Just in the right time. What a coincidence. Again, we see the sovereignty of God. And so the Philistines are attacking. God delivers David. But notice, God delivers David how? By his people over here being oppressed. Right? The Philistines are oppressing the people of Israel, God's people. We don't have God's wisdom. How is that good? It has to be good because it's of God. What saves David is other people of God going through a trial. And we have to understand that happens today at times as well. Again, the Creator often accomplishes His will in ways the created could never expect. So we read that David commemorates the event. He names a rock and celebrates of his deliverance. And you can go, I'm totally out of time, but you can go to Psalm 63 and read about David's feelings concerning this exact moment. David recognized his danger and he looked to the Lord for deliverance. Can we say that about ourselves? Do we say, my soul clings to you, your right hand upholds me? Do we allow the doctrine to govern our feelings? Or do we allow our feelings to drive our life? So we have to ask ourselves. Our feelings must always rest upon the promises of God. And when we're given a chance to reach for the sword or the ephod, we have to reach for the ephod first. Even though reaching for the sword may feel like the most practical thing to do. So next week, Elder Brian's going to walk us through chapter 24. David has the opportunity to go on the offensive, but he remains faithful to God's anointed. And David, at that point, is going to speak truth to Saul. And we're going to read how Saul, once again, is going to speak churchy. All the while, he's going to be acting and thinking of the world. Pastor Cal, would you close this, please, in prayer?